The Pentagon asked for $200 billion. Sounds massive, right? But what if that number doesn't include the most expensive parts of the war? Because when you look closer, the real cost goes far beyond what's officially reported. And the worst part? Most of it isn't even on the official bill. So what are we really paying for? And what's missing from that number? Now, here's what we know. Pentagon officials have requested an emergency supplemental in the range of $200 billion to fund operations tied to the conflict. That request is real and urgent. It covers immediate needs, munitions, repairs, logistics, and ongoing operations. But analysts warn this is only a short-term measure. It does not include many of the indirect, long-term, and Allied-borne costs that follow a high-intensity conflict. And that's where the real numbers start to change. Here's where the numbers start to get uncomfortable. Analysts estimate that the opening phase of this conflict was extraordinarily munition-intensive. In one commonly cited snapshot, the first 100 hours of engagement cost roughly $3.7 billion. That number reflects the outsized price of modern precision weapons. A Tomahawk cruise missile, reported in some earlier sources as Toma Rock, carries a unit cost in the multiple millions of dollars range, depending on the variant and whether supporting systems are factored in. Guided bombs, the set-and-forget GPS-aided kits known as JDAMs, sometimes transcribed inaccurately as JAMs, are cheaper per round but still cost hundreds of thousands to a few $1 million. Once delivery platforms, targeting, and logistics are counted. And then there are interceptors. Shooting down incoming missiles and drones is not free. Patriot batteries and systems like THAAD, sometimes transcribed elsewhere as TAD, rely on interceptors and supporting radars whose per-shot cost can be measured in the low single-digit millions. Analysts put a reasonable per-interceptor range around $2.4 million apiece in many public estimates. Multiply that by dozens, or hundreds, of incoming weapons, and the bill rises fast. Pentagon and defense analysts reported that, in the early days, interceptor expenditures alone accounted for a meaningful share of daily operational spending. Put together, offensive munitions, defensive interceptors, high sortie rates, and the consumables that go with carrier and air operations drove daily costs into the high hundreds of millions and, at peak moments, into the billion-dollar range. Some public estimates put the most intense days at roughly $1 to $2 billion. After the opening phase, when strike rates decline and operations normalize, daily spending appears to settle lower. Analysts suggest something on the order of $400–600 million per day once the first replenishment crunch and surge tempo ease. Those lower figures are still materially expensive over months. If you want clear, data-driven breakdowns like this, hit like and subscribe. Now, second, defensive costs and stockpile depletion. This is where the headline munitions math bleeds into longer-term risk. Defense officials and observers have repeatedly warned that high consumption rates quickly burn through stockpiles that were sized for lower-intensity contingencies. For some systems, annual production output is limited. Public reporting cited a planned production of roughly 190 Tomahawk missiles in a given year as an example of constrained throughput, a reported figure that should be verified against the latest contracts, but useful as an indicator of scale. When current combat operations consume hundreds of precision rounds, replenishing inventories requires both time and money. Factories must ramp. Suppliers across the industrial base must retool, and some components have long lead times measured in months to years. That matters strategically. Depleting interceptors and cruise missiles doesn't just increase short-term procurement costs, it reduces the U.S. military's margin for error elsewhere, in the Pacific, in NATO's eastern flank, in any future contingency. Rebuilding stockpiles also carries a premium. Wartime surge contracts and overtime raise unit costs, and the rush to secure raw materials and production capacity can create bottlenecks and higher prices across related defense programs. Third, operations and equipment losses. High sortie rates and constant naval presence are expensive. Rough published benchmarks, which should be treated as illustrative rather than definitive, put the cost of sustaining large numbers of tactical aircraft at tens of millions per day when fuel, maintenance, ordnance, and sortie generation are included. Similarly, a deployed carrier strike group carries operating costs often reported in the low tens of millions per day, accounting for the carrier itself, escorts, aviation fuel, and logistics. Repairs to damaged ships, runways, and airframes add another layer. There have been public reports of aircraft losses and major systems damaged during the campaign. Some sources cited the loss of several fighters, and each loss translates into a large repair or replacement bill, plus a reduction in capability that must be patched through temporary measures or accelerated procurement. When planners model scenarios of several months of sustained operations at these rates, the $200 billion supplemental starts to feel like a bridge, not a ceiling. For example, if the conflict sustained a pace that averaged even a few $100 million per day over 100 to 200 days, factoring in munitions, operations, logistics, and repair, the cumulative direct military cost climbs rapidly. Add to that the premium for industrial surges required to rebuild depleted inventories, and the direct defense tab can approach or exceed the supplemental request even before indirect economic effects are counted. Fourth, the industrial base constraint is not an academic point. It is a practical deadline. Many munitions are produced at a steady peacetime rate. Scale them up quickly, and costs per unit rise. Scale them down, and you risk facility shutdowns and loss of supplier networks. Analysts warn that the current consumption profile has forced the defense sector into surge mode. That surge has two consequences. First, higher program costs for expedited production. Second, longer lead times and competing demands. A factory retooled to produce thousands of guided munitions cannot instantly switch to producing entirely different ordnance. Global demand for certain components, semiconductors, specialty alloys, precision guidance kits, creates competition with civilian industries and allied procurements, further driving up price and stretch in delivery schedules. Fifth, the hidden economic costs, which are where the headline $200 billion really becomes incomplete. The most immediate and measurable of these is energy. Attacks in and around the Strait of Hormuz and strikes on Gulf infrastructure produced a shock to oil markets. The International Energy Agency described one period in which prices spiked drastically. Public numbers show crude moving from roughly the low 70s per barrel into well over $110 at peak, a jump in excess of 60% by some measures. That spike translates into billions of dollars of additional energy import cost per week for energy importing countries, higher gasoline prices at the pump for consumers, and higher input costs for manufacturing and transportation. Shipping and insurance costs rose in tandem. When a major shipping choke point feels insecure, insurers raise war risk premiums, shipping lines reroute, and freight times lengthen. Those changes have cascading effects: higher import bills for manufacturers, delayed deliveries for just-in-time supply chains, and higher prices for consumer goods. Agricultural inputs are not spared. Higher natural gas and oil prices translate into more expensive fertilizer production, which feeds into food prices globally over months and seasons. Sixth, a case study that makes the abstract concrete. Qatar's liquefaction infrastructure is a major regional asset. Public reporting and statements from Qatar Energy indicate that attacks damaged liquefaction trains at a major Qatari facility, with the company reporting the destruction or disabling of multiple trains. Some sources reported 2 out of 14 trains knocked offline, a hit that translated into roughly a mid-teens percentage loss of that exporter's immediate liquefaction capacity, numbers that regional energy analysts rounded to about 17% of export capacity. Repairing and rebuilding liquefaction trains is neither cheap nor quick. Industry estimates put reconstruction timelines in the multi-year range, commonly 3 to 5 years for full restoration, depending on supply chains and contractor capacity. Reported reconstruction cost estimates ran into the tens of billions. One widely cited figure was about $26 billion for major repair and replacement work, with annual revenue losses running into the tens of billions as well. Some public estimates placed foregone export revenues on the order of $20 billion a year. Those are not Pentagon line items. They are corporate balance sheet damages, regional GDP hits, and long-tail losses to the global LNG market that can raise energy bills worldwide for years while replacement capacity is developed. For countries that rely on LNG and pipeline supplies from the Gulf, in Europe, Asia, and parts of the developing world, the practical effect is reduced supply and higher prices that ripple through industry and household budgets. Seventh, tallying allied and regional damage multiplies the scale. Saudi industrial and energy facilities faced their own strike damage and repair costs. Ports, storage facilities, and processing plants across the UAE, Bahrain, and Kuwait suffered operational interruptions. When analysts aggregate direct infrastructure repair costs, lost export revenues, higher import bills, and the broader macroeconomic drag of elevated energy prices and shipping premiums, the regional economic damage compounds rapidly. Analysts estimate that when you combine U.S. direct military expenditures, the cost of replacing expended munitions, damaged Gulf energy infrastructure, and foregone export revenues, and the global economic ripple effects, the total economic footprint of the crisis can reach into the hundreds of billions. That remains an estimate, but an important one. Most of that burden does not hit the Pentagon's budget ledger. It lands on corporate accounts, allied governments, insurance pools, and ultimately consumers worldwide. Eighth, the political and procedural context that produces this gap between the $200 billion headline and the true economic footprint. Congress is being asked to authorize funds that are legally structured to cover certain defense-related activities in the short and midterm. Administration officials say the supplemental will finance replenishment of munitions, repairs, and continued operations, and they have pointed to prior transfers and allocations. For example, munitions and support previously provided to Ukraine as context for current stockpile levels. Lawmakers, analysts, and watchdogs are now debating how much of the broader economic impact should be considered in deliberations, and whether additional non-defense appropriations for energy stabilization, allied reconstruction, or economic support are necessary. There is a transparency question here. On the one hand, the Pentagon's budget process is designed to track defense obligations and some contingency costs. On the other hand, many of the largest economic effects are diffuse: lost export revenue in Qatar, higher shipping insurance premiums, and the agricultural price impacts of an energy shock are not easily or promptly captured by a single defense supplemental. That mismatch is not necessarily a conspiracy. It is a function of budgeting silos, the difference between national defense spending and global economic losses, and the time it takes for damage to infrastructure and markets to translate into accounting entries or policy responses. Ninth, what does this mean for policy and citizens? First, policymakers need clearer cross-agency accounting. A full picture of cost should integrate defense spending with predicted economic losses and allied reconstruction needs, so decision-makers understand trade-offs. Second, industrial base resilience requires sustained investment in peacetime production capacity and spare parts inventories or the political will to accept higher surge costs. Third, transparency matters for democratic oversight. If the public only sees the Pentagon's supplemental request without context, the broader fiscal and economic consequences remain hidden until they manifest as higher prices and long-term debt. Finally, the synthesis. The $200 billion supplemental request is real and consequential, but it is incomplete. Direct military costs, ordnance expended, interceptors used, sorties flown, ships and aircraft repaired, are only part of the picture. The industrial surge needed to rebuild stockpiles, the long timelines and high bills to repair damaged energy infrastructure in the Gulf, and the global economic ripple effects from higher energy, insurance, and freight costs all add significant, often off-budget costs. Analysts estimate that when you aggregate direct military expenditures with allied infrastructure losses and global economic impacts, the effective cost of this crisis becomes a multiple of the Pentagon's supplemental. That's the core point. The headline number matters, but it is not the whole bill. If policymakers, journalists, and citizens want an honest accounting, the debate needs to shift from a single emergency line item toward integrated budgeting and transparent, timely reporting on the cascading costs. The choice is not simply whether to fund more munitions. It is whether we will measure and publicly debate the full economic consequences of prolonged conflict. Subscribe and turn on notifications to stay up to date on how this crisis affects markets and security.